The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Trump International Palace as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her perfectly pressed blazer. As Donald Trump's personal secretary for 3 years, she had witnessed countless dramatic moments, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday in March. Sarah had arrived early, as was her custom, to prepare the daily briefings and organize Trump's packed schedule. The palace was unusually quiet, with most staff members still making their way through the elaborate security checkpoints. She loved these peaceful moments before the chaos of the day began, when she could move through the opulent halls without interruption. The Trump International Palace was a marvel of modern luxury, combined with classical architecture. Gold-trimmed corridors stretched endlessly, lined with priceless artwork and ornate mirrors that reflected the morning light streaming through crystal chandeliers. Every surface gleamed with meticulous care, maintained by a small army of dedicated staff members who took pride in keeping the residence pristine. As Sarah made her way to the executive wing, she noticed something peculiar. The usual morning patrol of royal guards seemed more tense than normal. Their typically stoic expressions appeared strained, and she observed several hushed conversations between security personnel. Captain Rodriguez, the head of palace security, was speaking urgently into his radio while gesturing toward the east wing. The royal guard system at the palace was unlike anything found at other government buildings. Trump had insisted on implementing a unique security protocol that combined traditional Secret Service protection with an elaborate ceremonial guard unit. These guards, dressed in distinctive navy blue uniforms with gold braiding, were responsible for both protection and maintaining the dignified atmosphere Trump demanded. Sarah entered her office, a spacious room adjacent to Trump's private study, and began reviewing the day's agenda. The schedule was particularly demanding, with back-to-back meetings scheduled from 8 in the morning until well past dinner time. Foreign dignitaries, business associates, and political advisors were all slated to visit throughout the day. At precisely 7:30, Sarah heard the familiar sound of Trump's voice echoing from his private quarters. Even from her office, she could tell his mood was already agitated. Years of working closely with him had taught her to read the subtle signs of his emotional state through the tone and volume of his voice. This morning something was clearly bothering him. The intercom on her desk buzzed sharply, making her jump slightly. Trump's voice crackled through the speaker with unusual urgency. He demanded that she immediately locate Captain Rodriguez and bring him to the private study for an emergency briefing. The tone in his voice suggested this was not a routine security update. Sarah quickly gathered her notepad and hurried toward the security office. The palace corridors, which had seemed peaceful just minutes earlier, now buzzed with activity. Staff members moved with purpose, their usual casual demeanor replaced by a sense of urgency that seemed to permeate the entire building. When she reached the security office, Captain Rodriguez was nowhere to be found. Deputy Captain Williams informed her that Rodriguez had been called away on an urgent matter, but refused to elaborate on the details. The deputy's evasive responses and nervous fidgeting only heightened Sarah's growing sense that something significant was happening. Returning to Trump's study without the captain, Sarah knocked gently on the heavy oak door. Trump's voice boomed from within, granting her permission to enter. She found him pacing behind his massive mahogany desk, his usually perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled. His face wore an expression of barely contained frustration. Trump immediately began questioning Sarah about the morning's activities. Had she noticed anything unusual? Were all the security protocols being followed properly? His rapid-fire questions came faster than she could answer, and his agitation seemed to increase with each passing moment. Before Sarah could provide detailed responses, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Multiple sets of boots moved quickly across the marble floors, accompanied by the static crackle of radio communications. Trump's eyes narrowed as he listened to the commotion, his jaw tightening with visible tension. The heavy silence that followed was broken by a sharp, piercing sound that neither Sarah nor Trump immediately recognized. It was a high-pitched electronic tone that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the palace walls. The sound continued for several seconds before abruptly stopping, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Trump's face darkened as he realized what they had just heard. The sound was unmistakably an alarm, but not one of the standard security alerts they were accustomed to. This was something different, something that triggered a response Sarah had never witnessed before. The phone on Trump's desk rang immediately, its shrill tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Sarah watched as Trump answered with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious concern. The conversation was brief and conducted in hushed tones, but Sarah could see from his expression that whatever information he was receiving was deeply troubling. When Trump ended the call, he turned to Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He instructed her to cancel all morning appointments and to ensure that no one entered the executive wing without his explicit permission. The urgency in his voice made it clear that this was not a request but a direct order. As Sarah prepared to leave the study to carry out his instructions, Trump called her back. He warned her that the events of this morning were to remain strictly confidential. Nothing she witnessed or overheard was to be discussed with anyone, including other staff members or security personnel. Walking back to her office, Sarah's mind raced with questions. The mysterious alarm, the agitated security personnel, and Trump's obvious distress all pointed to something far more serious than a routine security concern. She had worked in high-pressure government environments before, but this felt different. The rest of the morning passed in a strange atmosphere of controlled chaos. Phone calls were made and received with unusual frequency, but always in hushed tones. Staff members moved through the corridors with purpose, but avoided making eye contact or engaging in their usual friendly conversations. As Sarah sat at her desk, trying to concentrate on rescheduling the canceled appointments, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing the beginning of something that would change everything. The alarm that had sounded earlier continued to echo in her mind, a harbinger of the dramatic events that were about to unfold within the walls of the Trump International Palace. The mysterious alarm had stopped, but the tension in the Trump International Palace continued to build throughout the morning. Sarah Mitchell found herself caught in the middle of increasingly strange circumstances as she attempted to manage Trump's disrupted schedule while piecing together fragments of information about what had triggered the security alert. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah noticed a flurry of activity near the palace's main security checkpoint. Through her office window, she could see several black vehicles arriving in quick succession. Men in dark suits emerged from the cars, their serious expressions and purposeful movements suggesting they were federal agents or high-level security personnel from outside the palace. The arrival of these unknown officials coincided with what appeared to be a lockdown of certain sections of the building. Sarah observed palace staff being redirected away from the East Wing, where the most secure areas of the facility were located. The usual tour groups and visiting dignitaries were quietly escorted to alternative routes. Though most seemed unaware that anything unusual was happening, Captain Rodriguez finally appeared in Sarah's office doorway, his uniform slightly wrinkled and his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress. He requested an immediate meeting with Trump, explaining that there had been a significant security incident that required presidential attention. His carefully chosen words suggested the situation was more serious than a simple false alarm. When Sarah escorted the captain to Trump's study, she couldn't help but notice the change in atmosphere. The room, which had always been a symbol of power and control, now felt charged with anxiety. Trump sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished surface as he waited for Rodriguez to explain the morning's events. Captain Rodriguez began his briefing with obvious reluctance. He explained that at approximately 7:15 that morning, one of the newer royal guards had triggered an advanced security protocol while conducting a routine patrol of the palace's restricted areas. The guard, Marcus Thompson, had been with the palace security team for only 6 months. According to Rodriguez, Guard Thompson had been assigned to patrol the classified document storage area, a highly secure section of the palace that required special clearance and followed strict protocols. During his patrol, Thompson had noticed what appeared to be an unlocked filing cabinet in one of the restricted offices. Following standard procedure, he had attempted to secure the cabinet, but in doing so had accidentally activated a sophisticated alarm system. The alarm that Sarah and Trump had heard was not a standard security alert but rather a specialized breach notification system designed to detect unauthorized access to the most sensitive areas of the palace. The system was so advanced that it could distinguish between authorized personnel and potential security threats. automatically triggering a comprehensive lockdown protocol. Trump's reaction to this explanation was immediate and explosive. His face flushed red as he demanded to know how such a basic security failure could occur in his palace. He questioned why a new guard had been given access to such sensitive areas without proper supervision and why the filing cabinet had been left unlocked. In the first place, Captain Rodriguez attempted to explain the circumstances, but Trump's anger continued to escalate. He began pacing around the room, gesturing wildly as he outlined his expectations for palace security. The intensity of his reaction suggested that this incident had touched on deeper concerns about the security and management of his residence. Sarah, still present in the room taking notes, watched the exchange with growing unease. She had witnessed Trump's anger before, but this seemed different. There was an underlying tension that suggested the security breach had implications beyond what was being discussed openly. The situation became more complicated when Rodriguez revealed additional details about Guard Thompson's discovery. The unlocked filing cabinet had not been empty as expected. Instead, it contained documents that appeared to be related to ongoing political and business matters. The guard had glimpsed enough of the paperwork to realize it might be significant before properly securing the area and reporting the incident. This revelation caused Trump to stop pacing abruptly. His expression shifted from anger to what Sarah could only describe as alarm. He began asking specific questions about exactly what Thompson had seen and whether anyone else had been informed about the contents of the filing cabinet. Rodriguez assured Trump that Thompson had followed proper protocol by immediately reporting the incident and had not discussed his findings with anyone other than his immediate supervisors. However, the captain admitted that several other security personnel had been involved in responding to the alarm, and it was possible that word of the incident was beginning to spread among the palace staff. The meeting was interrupted by a sharp knock on the study door. Without waiting for permission to enter, Deputy Captain Williams burst into the room with obvious urgency. He whispered something to Rodriguez that caused both men's expressions to become even more serious. Trump demanded to know what new development had occurred. Williams reluctantly explained that Guard Thompson had requested an immediate meeting with Palace legal counsel. The young guard claimed he needed advice about his obligations regarding what he had observed during the security incident. This news seemed to drain the color from Trump's face. He sank into his chair, his earlier bluster replaced by what appeared to be genuine concern. Sarah had never seen him react this way to a security matter, and her curiosity about the true nature of the incident continued to grow. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, with frequent glances in Sarah's direction that made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. It became clear that the men were discussing matters they preferred she not overhear. But Trump had not dismissed her from the meeting. Rodriguez suggested that Thompson be immediately transferred to a different assignment while the incident was investigated. Trump agreed, but insisted that the guard be kept under close supervision and that his access to sensitive areas be revoked pending a full security review. As the meeting continued, Sarah began to understand that the morning's events represented more than a simple security breach. The reactions of everyone involved suggested that Guard Thompson's discovery had potentially serious implications for Trump and his administration. The phone on Trump's desk rang again, interrupting their discussion. The caller identification showed it was an internal palace line, but from an extension Sarah didn't recognize. Trump answered with obvious reluctance, and the brief conversation that followed seemed to confirm his worst fears about the developing situation. When he hung up, Trump turned to Rodriguez and Williams with an expression of grim determination. He instructed them to implement a full communications lockdown for the palace staff, and to ensure that no information about the morning's incident reached anyone outside the building. Sarah realized she was witnessing the beginning of a crisis that would test everyone involved. The mysterious alarm had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to expose secrets hidden within the walls of the Trump International Palace. The communications lockdown at the Trump International Palace created an atmosphere of barely controlled panic among the staff. Sarah Mitchell watched as normal palace operations ground to a halt, while security personnel scrambled to contain the fallout from Guard Thompson's discovery. The young guard had become the center of a storm that threatened to engulf everyone around him. By midday, the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had anticipated. Thompson, rather than accepting a quiet transfer to another assignment, had become increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding the documents he had seen. Through hushed conversations with other staff members, Sarah learned that the guard was questioning whether he had a legal obligation to report his findings to authorities outside the palace. Trump's response to Thompson's growing defiance was swift and severe. He ordered Captain Rodriguez to place the guard under immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. However, this decision only seemed to strengthen Thompson's resolve to speak out about what he had witnessed. The palace legal team, headed by attorney Margaret Chen, was called in for an emergency consultation. Chen, a sharp and experienced lawyer who had handled sensitive matters for Trump for several years, arrived at the palace within an hour of being summoned. Her usual calm demeanor showed signs of strain as she was briefed on the developing crisis. Sarah found herself in the unique position of observing these high-level discussions while maintaining her regular duties. Trump's insistence that she remain present during meetings meant she was privy to conversations that few others in the palace were allowed to hear. The weight of this responsibility began to weigh heavily on her as the day progressed. The documents that Thompson had discovered were apparently related to several ongoing business deals and political arrangements that Trump preferred to keep private. While Sarah couldn't determine the exact nature of these documents from the fragmented discussions she overheard, it was clear they contained information that could be damaging if made public. Attorney Chen's assessment of the situation was sobering. She explained to Trump that Thompson's position as a government employee gave him certain protections if he chose to report potential wrongdoing. The concept of whistleblower protection meant that any attempt to silence or intimidate the guard could result in even more serious legal consequences. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. A simple security patrol had uncovered documents that were supposed to be secure, and now the very person responsible for protecting the palace had become a potential threat to its occupants. The sophisticated security systems designed to keep outsiders away had failed to account for the possibility of problems coming from within. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice changes in the behavior of other palace staff members. Word of the morning's incident had apparently spread despite the communication lockdown. Conversations stopped abruptly when supervisors approached, and there was a general sense of unease that permeated the entire building. The situation became more complicated when Thompson requested a meeting with a representative from the Office of the Inspector General. This federal oversight agency had the authority to investigate potential misconduct within government operations, and their involvement would bring unwanted scrutiny to the palace's activities. Trump's reaction to this development was explosive. He demanded that Chen find a way to prevent Thompson from making contact with outside agencies. However, the attorney was forced to explain that any attempt to interfere with the guard's rights could constitute obstruction of justice, potentially turning a containable incident into a federal crime. The palace communications director, James Walsh, was brought into the crisis management team to develop strategies for handling potential media attention. Walsh, a veteran of multiple political campaigns, understood the importance of controlling the narrative before it could spiral out of control. Sarah observed Walsh's growing concern as he learned more details about the situation. The communications expert realized that the palace was facing a potential public relations disaster that could overshadow any positive news about Trump's administration. The challenge was to contain the story without appearing to engage in a cover-up. During an emergency strategy session, Walsh proposed several options for managing the crisis. These ranged from preemptively releasing a sanitized version of events to discrediting Thompson's credibility before he could speak to investigators. Each option carried significant risks and none guaranteed a positive outcome. Trump's frustration with the entire situation continued to mount throughout the day. He repeatedly questioned how such a basic security failure could occur in his residence and demanded accountability from his security team. However, his anger seemed to be masking a deeper concern about the potential consequences of Thompson's discovery. The young guard, meanwhile, had been confined to a secure area of the palace while legal and security teams debated how to handle his situation. Thompson's request to speak with outside counsel had been denied. But his determination to report what he had seen only seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing a conflict between competing principles. Thompson believed he had a duty to report potential wrongdoing, while Trump and his team were focused on protecting sensitive information and maintaining their political positions. Neither side seemed willing to compromise. The tension reached a breaking point when Thompson announced that he would contact media outlets if he was not allowed to speak with federal investigators. This threat represented Trump's worst nightmare, as it could lead to widespread public scrutiny of the palace's operations and the documents that had triggered the crisis. Chen advised Trump that the legal risks of continuing to detain Thompson were becoming too great to ignore. She recommended allowing the guard to meet with investigators while attempting to limit the scope of their inquiry. However, Trump was reluctant to give up control of the situation. As evening approached, Sarah realized that the morning's simple alarm had transformed into a full-blown crisis that threatened to expose secrets the palace had worked hard to protect. The question was no longer whether Thompson would speak out, but rather what the consequences would be when he did. The palace that had seemed so secure and controlled just hours earlier now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Sarah understood that her position as a witness to these events had placed her in a precarious situation, one that would test her loyalty and her conscience in ways she had never anticipated. The evening brought no relief to the mounting tension at the Trump International Palace. Guard Marcus Thompson's determination to contact federal investigators had created a deadline that loomed over everyone involved in the crisis. Sarah Mitchell found herself working late into the night as Trump and his advisors struggled to find a solution that would protect their interests while avoiding legal complications. Thompson had been moved to a guest suite in the palace under the pretense of providing him with comfortable accommodations while the situation was resolved. However, Sarah observed that his movements were being closely monitored by security personnel, and his access to communication devices had been severely restricted. The guard's isolation was becoming increasingly obvious to other staff members. The palace's head of public relations, James Walsh, had spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries with media contacts to gauge whether any news outlets had received tips about unusual activities at the residence. His preliminary findings were reassuring, as there seemed to be no immediate media interest in palace security matters. However, Walsh warned that this situation could change rapidly if Thompson succeeded in contacting journalists. Attorney Margaret Chen had been working with federal contacts to understand the legal implications of the guard's potential whistleblower claims. Her research revealed that Thompson's allegations, if substantiated, could trigger multiple investigations into the palace's operations. The documents he had discovered appeared to relate to areas that several government agencies had been quietly monitoring. As the night progressed, Sarah became aware of a growing division within Trump's inner circle about how to handle the crisis. Some advisors favored an aggressive approach that would discredit Thompson and minimize the significance of his discoveries. Others argued for a more conciliatory strategy that would address his concerns while limiting the damage to Trump's reputation. Trump himself seemed torn between his instinct to fight and his advisors' warnings about the legal risks of appearing to obstruct a potential investigation. His usual confidence had been replaced by an uncharacteristic uncertainty that was evident to everyone who interacted with him. The situation took an unexpected turn when Thompson's supervisor, Sergeant Patricia Morrison, requested a private meeting with Captain Rodriguez. Morrison, a 20-year veteran of palace security, had been Thompson's mentor since his arrival 6 months earlier. Her request suggested that she might have insights into the guard's motivations and potential actions. During her meeting with Rodriguez, Morrison revealed that Thompson had been expressing concerns about certain palace operations for several weeks before the incident. The young guard had apparently noticed irregularities in document handling procedures and had questioned whether all activities within the classified areas were being conducted according to proper protocols. This revelation was deeply troubling to Trump's team because it suggested that Thompson's actions were not simply the result of accidentally discovering sensitive documents. Instead, it appeared that he had been actively observing and questioning palace operations, which raised the possibility that he had gathered more information than initially believed. Morrison's briefing also revealed that Thompson had been keeping personal notes about his observations during his security patrols. These notes, which were stored in his personal locker, could potentially contain detailed information about Palace operations that went far beyond what he had seen in the unlocked filing cabinet. The discovery of Thompson's notes prompted an immediate search of his locker and workstation. The documents found there confirmed Morrison's warnings and revealed the extent of the guard's concerns about Palace security protocols. His observations were detailed and well documented, suggesting a level of attention that went beyond normal security duties. Trump's reaction to learning about Thompson's notes was intense and immediate. He ordered a comprehensive review of all security personnel to identify anyone else who might be harboring similar concerns about Palace operations. The prospect of additional whistleblowers emerging from within his own security team was clearly his worst nightmare. Sarah watched as the crisis management team struggled to adapt their strategy to address this new information. The presence of detailed notes meant that Thompson had evidence to support his claims, making it much more difficult to dismiss his allegations as the confused observations of an inexperienced guard. Chen's legal assessment became even more pessimistic as she reviewed Thompson's documentation. The notes demonstrated a pattern of observation and concern that would be compelling to investigators and difficult to discredit. The attorney warned that attempting to suppress or destroy the notes could constitute obstruction of justice. The Palace's information technology team was brought in to determine whether Thompson had made digital copies of his observations or had communicated his concerns to anyone outside the palace. Their analysis revealed that the guard had been researching whistleblower protection laws using palace computers, suggesting he had been planning to report his findings for some time. As midnight approached, Sarah realized that the crisis had evolved beyond anything the palace leadership had initially anticipated. What had begun as a simple security incident had revealed a systematic pattern of observation and documentation that could expose multiple aspects of palace operations to public scrutiny. The emergency strategy session that followed included Trump's most trusted advisors and centered on the question of whether to continue trying to contain Thompson or to get ahead of the story by releasing information voluntarily. Each option carried significant risks, and the debate became increasingly heated as the night wore on. Deputy Captain Williams reported that other security personnel were beginning to ask questions about Thompson's absence from duty and the unusual activities that had been taking place throughout the day. The communication lockdown was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as curious staff members noticed the disruption to normal palace operations. Sarah found herself taking detailed notes of all these developments while trying to process the implications of what she was witnessing. Her position as Trump's secretary had given her access to information that few others possessed, but it had also made her a potential witness to activities that could become the subject of federal investigations. The weight of her situation became clear when Chen pulled her aside for a private conversation about her role in the unfolding events. The attorney explained that Sarah's presence during confidential meetings and her knowledge of the palace's response to the crisis could make her a valuable witness for investigators. Chen's warning forced Sarah to confront the reality that her loyalty to Trump might come into conflict with her legal obligations if federal agencies became involved. The attorney advised her to consider her own position carefully and to seek independent legal counsel if the situation continued to escalate. As the night stretched on, Sarah realized that the morning's alarm had set in motion events that would test everyone's principles and loyalties. The question was no longer just about containing Thompson's allegations, but about how far everyone involved was willing to go to protect the secrets hidden within the Trump International Palace. The early morning hours brought a new urgency to the crisis at the Trump International Palace. Sarah Mitchell arrived before dawn to find that the situation had deteriorated overnight. Guard Marcus Thompson had somehow managed to contact a reporter from a major news organization, despite the restrictions placed on his communications, and word of a potential story was already beginning to circulate. Trump's rage upon learning of this development was unlike anything Sarah had witnessed during her years of service. He paced his office like a caged animal, alternately shouting at his advisors and demanding immediate action to prevent the story from being published. The careful composure he usually maintained in crisis situations had completely abandoned him. The reporter who had been contacted Investigative journalist Rebecca Stone from the Washington Herald was known for her aggressive pursuit of government accountability stories. Stone had built her reputation on exposing corruption and misconduct at the highest levels of government, making her exactly the type of journalist the Palace team had hoped to avoid. Communications Director James Walsh reported that Stone had already begun making inquiries with other government agencies about the Palace's security protocols and recent activities. Her preliminary questions suggested that Thompson had provided her with enough information to begin a serious investigation into the documents he had discovered. Attorney Margaret Chen's assessment of the legal situation had become increasingly dire. She explained that once a credible news organization became involved, the Palace's options for containing the story were severely limited. Any attempt to interfere with the reporter's investigation could result in additional charges of obstruction and witness intimidation. The Palace's security team had launched an investigation into how Thompson had managed to contact the reporter despite their surveillance. Deputy Captain Williams discovered that the guard had used a maintenance worker's cell phone during a brief period when his movements were not being directly monitored. This security failure added another layer of concern about the Palace's ability to control the situation. Sarah found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as she witnessed the desperate measures being considered to prevent the story from breaking. Some advisors suggested discrediting Thompson by questioning his mental stability or fabricating evidence of misconduct. Others proposed offering financial incentives to convince him to retract his statements. The most disturbing proposal came from a political consultant who suggested creating a distraction by manufacturing a different crisis that would overshadow Thompson's allegations. This strategy would involve deliberately leaking information about a less damaging issue to redirect media attention away from the guard's discoveries. Chen firmly rejected these proposals, warning that they could constitute criminal conduct and would likely make the situation worse if discovered. However, Sarah could see that Trump was becoming increasingly desperate and might be willing to ignore legal advice if he felt cornered by the developing crisis. The situation became more complicated when Thompson's family members began receiving phone calls from unknown individuals asking questions about the guard's background and personal life. These calls suggested that someone was conducting an investigation into Thompson's history, possibly looking for information that could be used to discredit him. Morrison, Thompson's supervisor, reported that the guard was becoming increasingly agitated about his treatment and was demanding immediate access to legal representation. She warned that any further restrictions on his movements or communications could push him to become even more cooperative with the journalist investigating the story. The Palace's information technology team had been working through the night to determine the full extent of Thompson's documentation and whether any copies of his notes existed outside the building. Their findings revealed that the guard had been more thorough than anyone had initially realized in documenting his observations about Palace operations. Sarah watched as the crisis management team struggled to develop a coherent strategy for dealing with the mounting pressure. Each new development seemed to make their situation worse, and the options for containing the damage were rapidly diminishing. The first indication that the story was about to break came when Rebecca Stone contacted the Palace's press office requesting comment on specific allegations related to document security and potential misconduct. Her questions were detailed and well-informed, suggesting that Thompson had provided her with substantial information about his discoveries. Walsh's response to Stone's inquiry was carefully crafted to avoid confirming any specific details while attempting to characterize the incident as a minor security matter that had been appropriately handled. However, the journalist's follow-up questions made it clear that she was not satisfied with this explanation. The news that Stone was planning to publish her story within 24 hours sent shockwaves through the Palace hierarchy. Trump's inner circle realized that they were facing an imminent public relations disaster that could have serious legal and political consequences for everyone involved. Chen advised Trump that his best option at this point was to cooperate with any official investigations that might result from the news story while attempting to minimize the damage through careful public relations management. However, this advice was clearly not what Trump wanted to hear. The attorney also warned Sarah privately that she should prepare for the possibility of being contacted by investigators or journalists seeking information about the palace's response to the crisis. Chen advised her to consider her own legal position carefully and to avoid making any statements that could later be construed as attempts to cover up wrongdoing. As the day progressed, Sarah began to understand that the events she had witnessed over the past 2 days had fundamentally changed her relationship with Trump and her position at the palace. She was no longer simply a secretary maintaining schedules and managing communications. She had become a witness to a potential scandal that could reshape the political landscape. The palace staff, many of whom had been kept in the dark about the details of the crisis, began to sense that something serious was happening. The continued presence of outside legal counsel, the unusual security measures, and the obvious tension among senior staff members created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear throughout the building. Thompson, meanwhile, had apparently been moved to a secure location outside the palace, ostensibly for his own protection, but more likely to prevent him from having further contact with journalists or investigators. This development suggested that the palace team was still hoping to find a way to control the narrative before it became public. Sarah realized that she was approaching a crossroads where she would need to choose between her loyalty to Trump and her own principles and legal obligations. The decisions she made in the coming hours could determine not only her own future but also her role in either perpetuating or exposing what appeared to be a significant abuse of power within the highest levels of government. The moment of truth arrived sooner than anyone at the Trump International Palace had anticipated. Rebecca Stone's article was published online at 6 in the morning, 3 hours earlier than the news organization had initially indicated. The story's headline read, "Palace Guard Exposes Security Lapses and Document Mishandling at Trump Residence," and its contents were even more damaging than the crisis management team had feared. Sarah Mitchell was among the first to read the article, having set up news alerts on her phone to monitor for any mentions of the palace. The story contained detailed information about Thompson's discoveries, including specific references to the types of documents he had found and the security protocols that had apparently been violated. Stone had clearly done her homework. The immediate reaction within the palace was one of barely controlled panic. Trump's phone began ringing constantly as political allies, business associates, and family members called seeking explanations for the allegations contained in the news story. Each conversation seemed to increase his frustration and anger as he struggled to provide answers to questions he wasn't prepared for. Communications. Director James Walsh found himself overwhelmed by media requests for additional information about the story. News organizations that had initially shown no interest in palace security matters were now demanding interviews with palace officials and requesting access to documents related to Thompson's allegations. The article's publication also triggered immediate interest from federal oversight agencies. Within hours of the story going online, representatives from the Office of the Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office had contacted the palace requesting information about the security incident and the documents Thompson had discovered. Attorney Margaret Chen's worst fears about the legal implications of the crisis were being realized faster than she had anticipated. The news story had effectively forced federal agencies to investigate allegations they might have otherwise been able to ignore or handle quietly. The public nature of the accusations made it impossible for anyone to sweep the matter under the rug. Sarah watched as Trump's carefully constructed world began to unravel around him. The palace that had been a symbol of his power and success was now the center of a scandal that threatened to expose activities he had worked hard to keep private. His usual bravado was replaced by a desperate search for someone to blame for the disaster. The palace staff, who had been kept largely in the dark about the crisis, were now learning about the situation through news reports like everyone else. Many were shocked to discover the extent of the problems that had been brewing behind the scenes, and some began questioning their own positions within the organization. Thompson's location remained a closely guarded secret, but Sarah knew from overheard conversations that he was being kept at a secure facility outside the city, while investigators determined how to handle his case. The guard's cooperation with the journalist had made him a key witness in what was rapidly becoming a federal investigation. The political ramifications of the story began to manifest almost immediately. Opposition leaders called for congressional hearings into palace security practices, while Trump's allies struggled to defend activities they knew little about. The scandal was threatening to overshadow other political initiatives and derail important policy discussions. Sarah found herself in an increasingly untenable position as reporters began asking questions about her role in the palace and her knowledge of the events described in Stone's article. She had been mentioned by name in the story as Trump's personal secretary, making her a person of interest for journalists seeking additional sources of information. Chen had warned Sarah that she might be subpoenaed to testify before congressional committees or federal investigators about what she had witnessed during the crisis. The attorney advised her to consider hiring her own legal representation to protect her interests as the investigation expanded. The strain of the developing scandal was evident in Trump's behavior throughout the day. He canceled all public appearances and refused to take calls from most political allies, instead focusing his attention on damage control efforts that seemed increasingly futile. With each passing hour, the palace's legal team was working around the clock to prepare responses to the multiple investigations that were being launched. Federal agencies were requesting hundreds of documents related to security protocols, personnel files, and the classified materials that Thompson had discovered. Each request represented another potential source of damaging information. Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of other palace staff members as the reality of the situation sank in. Some longtime employees were quietly updating their resumes and reaching out to contacts in other organizations. The loyalty that had once bound the palace team together was beginning to fracture under the pressure of the scandal. The media coverage of the story continued to expand throughout the day as additional news organizations picked up the story and began their own investigations. Television news programs devoted extensive coverage to the allegations, with legal experts and former government officials weighing in on the potential consequences of the security lapses. By evening, it became clear that the palace's attempts to contain the crisis had failed completely. What had begun as a simple security incident had evolved into a major political scandal that was dominating news coverage and threatening to trigger serious legal consequences for everyone involved. Trump's inner circle was fragmenting as advisors began positioning themselves to minimize their own exposure to potential criminal charges. The unity that had once characterized his team was being replaced by a every person for themselves mentality that made coordinated damage control efforts nearly impossible. Sarah realized that her time at the palace was coming to an end, regardless of how the crisis ultimately resolved. Her knowledge of the events surrounding Thompson's discovery and the subsequent cover-up attempts had made her a liability that Trump could no longer afford to keep close. The question was whether she would leave voluntarily or wait to be forced out. The evening brought news that Thompson had been granted protective custody by federal marshals after receiving what authorities described as credible threats against his safety. This development suggested that the stakes of the investigation were higher than anyone had initially realized and that powerful interests were working to silence the guard. Chen advised Trump that his legal jeopardy was increasing with each attempt to manage the crisis through non-legal means. She warned that any further efforts to influence witnesses or suppress evidence could result in obstruction of justice charges that would be far more serious than the original allegations. As Sarah prepared to leave the palace that evening, she understood that she was walking away from more than just a job. She was leaving behind a world of power and privilege that had defined her professional life for 3 years. The events of the past few days had shown her that loyalty to powerful people could come at a cost she was not prepared to pay. The palace that had once seemed like an impregnable fortress was now revealed to be a house of cards that had collapsed at the slightest touch. The sophisticated security systems and careful protocols had been no match for the simple honesty of a young guard who believed in doing the right thing. Sarah's final act as Trump's secretary was to secure her own copies of notes and documents that might be relevant to the ongoing investigations. She understood that these materials might be crucial for protecting herself and ensuring that the truth about the palace's operations would eventually come to light, regardless of the powerful forces aligned against it. 3 weeks after the Washington Herald published Rebecca Stone's explosive article, the Trump International Palace bore little resemblance to the confident seat of power it had once been. Sarah Mitchell stood in her empty office, packing the last of her personal belongings as federal investigators continued their work in other parts of the building. The transformation had been swift and devastating. The congressional hearings had begun just 5 days after the story broke, with Thompson providing compelling testimony about his discoveries and the subsequent attempts to silence him. His detailed notes and documentation had proven to be even more damaging than anyone had initially anticipated, revealing a pattern of document mishandling and security violations that went far beyond the single incident that had triggered the crisis. Sarah had received her subpoena exactly 1 week after the story's publication. Unlike some of Trump's other advisors, she had chosen to cooperate fully with investigators rather than attempt to fight the legal process. Her decision had been influenced partly by Chen's warnings about the dangers of obstruction, but mostly by her growing conviction that the truth needed to come out. Her testimony before the House Oversight Committee had been front-page news for several days. Sarah had provided detailed accounts of the crisis management meetings she had witnessed, the attempts to suppress Thompson's allegations, and the discussions about discrediting the young guard. Her insider's perspective on the palace's response had filled in crucial gaps in the investigators' understanding of events. The impact of her testimony on Trump had been immediate and severe. He had publicly denounced her as a disloyal opportunist seeking attention, but the accuracy of her statements had been corroborated by other witnesses and documentary evidence. His attempts to discredit her had only served to reinforce the credibility of her account. Captain Rodriguez and several other security officials had also been called to testify, providing additional details about the security failures that had enabled Thompson's discovery. Their testimony had revealed systemic problems with the palace's document handling procedures that raised questions about other potentially sensitive materials that might have been compromised. The Department of Justice had launched a criminal investigation into potential obstruction of justice charges related to the attempts to silence Thompson and suppress evidence. Several of Trump's closest advisors were already facing indictments, and prosecutors had made it clear that additional charges were likely as their investigation continued. The political consequences of the scandal had been equally severe. Trump's approval ratings had plummeted as details of the cover-up attempts became public, and several key allies had distanced themselves from his administration. Congressional Republicans who had initially defended him were now calling for accountability and transparency in palace operations. Sarah's decision to cooperate with investigators had cost her more than just her job. She had received threatening phone calls and hostile messages from Trump supporters who viewed her as a traitor. Her personal security had become a concern, and she had been forced to move to a new apartment and change her daily routines to avoid harassment. However, she had also received support from unexpected sources. Whistleblower advocacy groups had praised her courage in speaking out, and several job offers had materialized from organizations that valued her integrity and insider knowledge of government operations. The prospect of rebuilding her career outside Trump's orbit was both frightening and liberating. Thompson had become something of a folk hero among government accountability advocates. Though he had largely avoided public attention since providing his initial testimony, the young guard had been transferred to a position with a different federal agency, where his attention to detail and commitment to proper procedures were viewed as assets rather than liabilities. The ongoing investigations had revealed that the documents Thompson discovered were related to several questionable business deals and political arrangements that were now under scrutiny by multiple federal agencies. The implications of these revelations extended far beyond the original security incident and threatened to expose a broader pattern of misconduct. The palace itself had been transformed from a symbol of power into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of institutional safeguards. Tour groups that once marveled at its opulence now heard stories about the scandal that had brought down its most powerful occupant. Sarah's final meeting with Chen had provided some closure to her involvement in the crisis. The attorney had commended her for making the difficult decision to tell the truth, despite the personal costs involved. Chen had also warned her that the legal proceedings were likely to continue for months or even years. meaning that her connection to the scandal would remain part of her life for the foreseeable future. As Sarah walked through the palace corridors one last time, she reflected on how a simple alarm had set in motion events that had changed everything. The sophisticated security systems and careful protocols had been no match for the basic human qualities of honesty and courage that Thompson had demonstrated. The young guard's decision to speak out about what he had seen had exposed the fragility of the power structures that had seemed so permanent just weeks earlier. His actions had proven that even the most well-protected secrets could be vulnerable to someone with the determination to do what was right. The scandal had also demonstrated the crucial role that individuals like Sarah could play in either perpetuating or exposing wrongdoing. Her choice to tell the truth rather than protect her employer had been difficult, but it had ultimately contributed to holding powerful people accountable for their actions. As she left the Trump International Palace for the final time, Sarah understood that she had been part of something larger than herself. The events that had begun with Marcus Thompson's discovery had become a turning point that would influence how government accountability and whistleblower protection were viewed for years to come. The empty corridors that had once buzzed with activity now served as a reminder that no institution, regardless of how powerful it appeared, was immune to the consequences of ethical failures. The alarm that had started everything had done more than just expose a security breach. It had revealed the fundamental importance of integrity and transparency in positions of public trust. Sarah's story would become part of the historical record of how a single moment of discovery had brought down a presidency and reminded the nation that accountability was not just an ideal but a practical necessity for preserving democratic institutions.